two dwarven brothers Brokkr and Sindri. They had originally planned to make a large warhammer, but Loki...
I believe you're mistaken here, and let me explain why. So, I know some people will look at sources like this, Neil Gaiman's Norse mythology, and they will assume that this is accurate to the sagas and Eddas. It's not. He embellished it. He's a very talented author, but if you read this as a source, it's not accurate. So you always want to go back to the original sagas and Eddas, like the Prose Edda by Snorri Sturluson. And you can look at different examples of writing in history, and you can look at depictions of Mjölnir. Mjölnir, I don't believe it was a warhammer. I don't think it was ever intended to be so. And if we look at Skaldskaparmál, which I'll also pull up, there's no mention of their original plan to make it a warhammer. There are two mentions, which I'll point out here in a few moments, that could have been ruined if Brokkr didn't keep the temperature up. And with the fly biting him on the eyelid, it distracted him. So it was almost ruined. And then there was a later part where he's actually showing it and presenting Mjolnir. Specifically, they don't call it Mjolnir in Skaldskaparmál, they just say the hammer. When they present it to Thor, they mention there's a flaw with the handle being shorter, but not how much shorter. So if we look at medieval weaponry, and I'll give a few examples of warhammers are designed for maneuverability. If you have a real big, heavy hammer, like if you were to take a sledgehammer today and try to swing that around, you're going to injure yourself. You're not going to use that in combat. So when warhammers were designed, and we can look at, again, some European ones, because we've got plenty of examples of those, with it being so small and light, it's basically a two-handed shaft that you could use one or two hands on, and the head either sometimes has a spike on the back or sometimes it doesn't, but it's a very, very, very small head. All the depictions that we have of Mjolnir, whether it be on different stones for different depictions of it being held, or if we look at the pendants, some of the pendants, of course, has a very unique shape to the head of it. And when I read Skaldskaparmál, I look at that handle there as being short even for a typical one-handed hammer, let alone a war hammer. I've got this other one here, but it's going to be hard to get out of the bag. But you get the idea that the pendant, the broad head, doesn't look like it would be a warhammer head. And then there is also a story stone that you can actually find, and it has Thor fishing for the Midgard serpent, and it's like a rectangular block. It's like a really big block with a tiny handle. So each time we see a depiction of Mjolnir, it's typically pretty bulky and girthy. There is one in Psalm 66 which has Mjolnir looking more like a typical type of a hammer, and that one might be more closer to what you might imagine a warhammer would be like. But aside from that one depiction, most of the other depictions that we have doesn't suggest that it was that way. And in Skaldskaparmál specifically, there's no mention of Brokkr and Sindri specifically what length they were planning it or what use they were planning the hammer for, just that he could hit things with the hammer. I believe this was very symbolic because hammers can be used for creation, for destruction. I mean, you can hit things and break them, you can build things, you can forge things. There's a whole bunch of different uses for hammers. Now, if we look at Scandinavian society, weapons that you would see in Scandinavia are going to be like, a shield was pretty typical to be carried, which has a very unique use. A lot of people think you strap it to the arm. You don't. You have that center peg, and you have that boss around the hand, and it's supposed to move a little bit. So you have these circular shields that they had. They had swords. They had knives. Typically, there's something called like a sax is one of the names that I've heard for it, like a single blade short sword almost, more dagger-like. You would have a axe, you would have a two-handed axe, you would have a spear, and you would have a bow and arrow, but you don't see warhammers typically as a Scandinavian weapon. And if anybody has evidence to the contrary, please share that. But as far as I know, they didn't have warhammers. That doesn't mean they can't pick up something on the battlefield, but it doesn't make sense to me to have this specifically try to be a warhammer, because it's also very unique to all of the different pantheon that they have in Scandinavia to have one of them with a hammer specifically designed for war, again, without it being suggested. So that's why I think that's wrong. As far as the Loki part, turning into a fly, it never says it's Loki that turned into a fly. Yes, I can understand that it can be assumed, and you have, again, stories like this that says it was Loki, but without it saying that it was specifically Loki and just a fly, but his hand, his neck, and his eyelid, we're making assumptions there. It's a leap. So I don't think we can say, yes, Loki tried to ruin that. It does stand with his character. He did have the ability to shapeshift. He had a bet. He had a lot invested. I mean, his head was on the line. So I get that it can be implied, but because it doesn't directly say so, I think I would be careful with that assumption. Now let's look at Skaldskaparmál. Valuespell.org is a great source for Skaldskaparmál. It has both the Icelandic, Old Icelandic, and the English translation. And we're talking about 43 here. Av smiðu I Varlisona och Sindra dvegs. So basically this translates about the smith, son of Ivaldi, and about the dwarf Sindri. So there's, two different parts here where we're talking about, so we have the mention of the fly. Again, there's no mention of Loki being that fly. We just have the fly interrupting all three items being crafted. And towards the bottom here, we have this section here where he's getting stung. And this is where, then Sindri laid iron in the hearth and bade him blow, saying that it would be spoiled if the blast failed. Straightway the fly had settled between Brokkr's eyes, stung his eyelid. But when the blood fell into his eyes so that he could not see, then he clutched at it, blah, 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 blah. Then the smith came thither, so we're talking about Sindri coming back to the forge because his brother was working the bellows, and said that it had come near to spoiling all that was in the hearth. Then he took from the forge. So it says it came close to spoiling, but not what was spoiling or what the original design was. It just has him laying iron there, and the bellows being blown and possibly being ruined. Then if we jump down where he's actually presenting it to Thor, it has here, again, doesn't mention Mjölnir. You can read the old Icelandic over here on the right. There's no mention of Mjölnir. It just says, then he gave the hammer to Thor and said that Thor might smite as hard as he desired. So this is all those properties that was mentioned in that video and others, and that's accurate with this description. But again, it doesn't say anything here about the length of the handle. What it does say, let's see, he might keep it in. It says, but indeed, it was a flaw in the hammer that the forehaft was somewhat short. So this is the line where I think people make the assumption it was supposed to be a two-handed warhammer. But again, I don't think that's very clear. Even if you look at the Icelandic, even if you get someone who speaks Icelandic or you try to translate it with a translation app, I don't think it's very clear that it was supposed to be a two-handed warhammer or a warhammer period. I think that's just an assumption. Now let's look at some warhammers. Just some real high-level examples. A lot of these are modern reproductions, but you can look up historical ones. But the head of the hammer is always going to be super tiny because, again, this is meant to swing around in battle for long periods of time. Yeah, look them up. Look up different warhammers from different nations. Try to find ones that are museum accurate, not cosplay, fantasy, or roleplay, or wall hangers. Actual warhammers, and you will see that they are much smaller than what you see on the designs of Mjölnir. All right, 2017, I went to the Viking exhibit at the museum. Here are some Mjölnir pendants that were found. You can notice, again, talking about that very short haft. Even this one, which has the elongated top, which I guess technically you can consider warhammer because of how short that was. That's, I don't know. I'm not sure if we're going to consider that a warhammer or not. That's just my personal opinion. Here is that stone that I was talking about where it actually shows Thor holding Mjölnir, fishing for the Midgard serpent. And then in Psalm 66, as I'd mentioned, here is Thor. You can see he has his belt on and his gauntlets. That hammer there, again, doesn't look like a typical warhammer. And again, that wouldn't necessarily fit with Scandinavia. This same thing in Psalm 66, you can see a depiction of Odin over here. And he's got this big curved sword, which is not traditional either. So I don't know how much stock we can put into this particular depiction of Thor. There is a later one where he's, again, fishing for the Midgard serpent, and again you can see him wearing his belt here, and you can see Mjölnir in his hand as well, but again does not really look too much like a warhammer in my opinion. Those are the two biggest things that stood out to me, aside from saying Thor's the god of thunder, because the whole god of or goddess of is kind of like a Roman Greek thing. They don't really refer to them like that in Scandinavia. If you look at any of the old sagas and stories, there are different things associated with them, like lightning and thunder is associated with Thor, but the Aesir, Vanir, and Jotnar are almost personifications of nature itself. Thor, in a way, is thunder versus of thunder. That's a whole nother conversation. But either way, it's fun to talk about this stuff. It's fun to go back to the original sources, and I present this to you so that you can go back to the original sources and come up with your own opinion. Do you think Mjölnir was a warhammer? Yes, no? Why or why not, based upon the original text? Support it with some evidence and back it up with some sources, and let's have a conversation. Best of luck.